Do we have any questions for the audience? Yes, ma'am.
I believe it was Professor Crooke that discussed Nike and how they've gotten a lot better in regards to their environmental issues. So basically, are they saying that they no longer use sweatshops to create their products?
Well, I would definitely invite you to go online and visit their CSR report, where that very question is addressed. And but just a short answer: no, they're not saying that. But they are saying that everything is transparent. For instance, you can actually go online and you can see when their last inspection was in a factory, how many people had were working overtime, were getting paid for it, how many people were underage, it's all open. There's no secrets, there's no corporate secrets. So they're in constant improvement mode. And where there's chronic problems over and over and they're not getting fixed, they shut the factory down.
Dr. Garmaise, after we spoke, it occurred to me, did you look at your mortgage brokers at their years doing it? 20-year veterans versus people that everybody and their neighbor went and got a mortgage broker's license and working out of the garage over the last like 5-10 years, whether the end of years of experience with these guys with bad loans were doing it for 3 years versus guys with 15 years and reputations to protect?
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of at the heart of the study. I don't have their whole career as a mortgage broker, just their one relationship with this bank. But it's exactly what you're saying. It wasn't the case that the new guys were worse. It was actually the long-term relationships where the performance seemed to drop off quite substantially.
Not with the bank so much as the individual, if they had a long-term 20-year career?
So that I couldn't observe. I just had the relationship with the one bank, yeah.
Hello, Mr. Paradowski. I would like to ask you a question. On your second slide, you showed the model how you calculate the value of the project.
For which one?
On the second, your second slide was.
Okay.
So I'm interested, you mentioned after some intangible values, tangible and intangible. So I'm interested in how do you measure intangible?
So what we typically do with intangibles, and I've seen it done 3 different ways now, in different organizations. Is one is as they're picking the different departmental goals that a project will address, the number of, and they can usually get up to 3. We would give them up to a score. So the first strategic goal they get 15 points for. The second strategic goal that they were impacting would be another 10 points to the score. And then the third goal would be another 5 points. So you couldn't overload it, but at the same time you counted for a little bit higher score to projects that addressed multiple of the different departmental goals. So it was really more, while the actual end result of hitting those strategy goals were not necessarily computed as a hard benefit, they factored into the strategic component of the score.
Thank you.
Follow-up questions? Question to her.
Sure.
Out of curiosity, when you did measure the value of intangible goals and you rated it by departmental value, was there a variance between how the department rated the value of those goals as opposed to how executive management saw the value of those goals as well?
Well, the value of the goals were actually driven by executive management, and they started at each individual business unit head, and those business unit leads put the goals in place, and it was actually the CEO and the CFO confirmed that those were of value. And one of the tuning items that we actually did with the model for a couple of different instances were, some people said, hey, I believe strategic alignment is good, but it was a lower overall impact to the overall score than, say, a financial return was. So where a financial return was, would represent out of the 100-point total, financial return was probably a little bit higher weighted than the strategic. So that's usually where the tweaking comes in. But it was actually, this was an exercise that went all the way up to the CEO and the CFO level in the organizations we dealt with.
Were you often surprised at how differently they were rated?
That was one of the more enlightening parts of the exercise, not just for us, but also for everybody in the organization as they went through and understood what the CEO and the CFO valued the most. And I think in one organization, I'll give you an example, the cost efficiency side was the piece that was actually the most heavily valued by both the CEO and the CFO. Whereas I think most of the departments had figured that getting new customers was going to be the higher value. And they were a little shocked when the CEO and the CFO weighted the cost efficiency. And their perspective was, you shave off 0.5% on every single customer I have, that's worth more to the bottom line to me than getting an extra 10,000 customers. So.
Quick question for Dr. Garmaise. I found it intriguing that your objective evidence was overwhelming to support your opinion. So I have a question, it's more subjective on your behalf. And that is, why do you suppose the brokers did what they did? Now, I think your primary motivator you mentioned was they were driven by greater commissions. But when we think about the ethics behind it, what would be your personal opinion, whether you studied it or not, or have an objective opinion? What would be your subjective opinion on the matter?
Okay, yeah, so as you're suggesting, I think incentives are very important, and my first response would be, let's think about restructuring incentives so as to make sure we don't see a problem like this. But okay, you're asking a second, maybe a deeper question. You know, in their defense, I would say we'd never seen a blowout on the order of the one that we saw now. Maybe they thought, okay, this is a slightly worse customer, but it doesn't really matter. 99% of loans don't end up going bust anyways. This is sort of a marginal difference for the bank. And for me, it's a significant big commission. I'm getting somebody into his house. There are lots of ways of telling stories to justify this. I think it's only ex post that we saw how serious the problem was that it maybe became clear that, you know, there were serious ethical issues as well.
My question is for Mr. Paradowski. How do you manage conflict in an organization where we have a new acquisition? Where we have a new acquisition with a separate operational and a management team, but is dependent on the centralized financial team that allocates resources financially or any otherwise possible.
So you're saying how do you manage the cost versus the provider organization that's performing the services versus the requesting organization?
Yes, and you know, we gave a separate management and an operational team so that the new acquisition could run on their own without getting influenced by us. But now, when we are allocating a budget for various product development ideas that they're bringing up, we are facing conflict within our current teams for the same resources. And it's how do we manage this conflict where operationally they're separate, but financially they're dependent on us?
So what I've seen is you can do it by financial allocation, but to your point, where you're hitting the contention now is resource constraints. So what we actually recommend, and we had one of the telecommunications providers we worked with, they had recently acquired a subdivision that did a completely different type of service. And what they did is they allocated them a budget, and when it came to the IT side, they split capacity to align with that budget. So they actually segregated the provider from the two different providing components of the organization, specifically so that they could manage them separately, because it was important to them to make sure they understood how each would be able to value independently, and then the roll up was done at the finance department level, and ultimately so that the decision for the allocation was done by the CEO and the CFO, and then different business units had different allocations of budgets for one product versus another. So it's kind of a hard, kind of more of a siloed approach, but it worked for the organization because they weren't ready to integrate them fully yet. So.
If I may, in listening to all four presentations, I noted there was a common element of transparency in the stories, a bit about transparency to the public, transparency to the customer, perhaps the transparency to what the brokers were actually doing for a living, and transparency to projects. I'd be interested in your comments, each of you, on that cultural change for the organizations you've worked with, and how that increase in transparency, that knowledge, that data is processed by those organizations, how they've dealt with it.
Well, I guess I'll start since Mike pointed to me. He passed the ball. I was beginning to doze off. I think that transparency is absolutely essential in a world where you can't hide. It's absolutely impossible if you think that you are going to protect information for any period of time. I think we live in a reality where we're very concerned about our privacy. So in terms of creating a culture of trust, I think first of all you have to recognize that, and you have to recognize that if you have a strategy, a corporate strategy, in which you want to provide opportunities for your customer to interact with you in different ways, then you have to have on the back end a culture that understands that there's going to be a lot of exposure and has the freedom and the flexibility to respond to that as appropriate. This is very difficult because we grew up in a world, most of us, in which there were a lot of silos, and knowledge was power. If I hoard it, then I become powerful. It's how I keep my job. It's because I know how to do this thing. And what we find ourselves in is a world where really the network is much more important than our individual knowledge. But that's a very difficult transformation. We see that even in terms of our school here. We have a library, like a physical library, which is important. But we grew up in a world where you put things in books, and the people who put those things in the books had a specific credibility that was imbued by institutions. And we like to build on our computers even, don't we? Folders and files and folders. And we have this taxonomy for how we collect knowledge. And it affects how we view transparency when you jump to a world in which there's a web of knowledge and a web of information that you can access by searching. You don't have to know where to find it. So I think a lot of education and awareness within our organization of where we're headed, and the fact that it's inescapable. You can't deny or think that you can hide something in the past is an important step forward.
I think there's a kind of a counterpoint to transparency, though, where sometimes too much transparency starts giving people the ability, and it happens in a lot of organizations where all of a sudden now they're looking at the cost structure, and you can get some data as to whether or not somebody's meeting their cost commitments. And there was this kind of implied degree of, hey, I'm being held for the benefits, but I want you to be held to the same scrutiny and costs. And some of the business units started really digging into the delivery aspect of the performing organizations. And it did lose a little bit of the trust because, at some point IT and engineering had to stop and say, listen, hey, this is sometimes part of our natural process, and there will be some overruns, but we're going to manage the portfolio of capacity in a way that we know how to do best. You don't need to know all those details. So there was a little bit of that pushback in our situation.
And I think this is a really good point. It comes down to being very open and transparent about governance, how decisions were made, as opposed to thinking it wasn't a democracy, there was a governance structure, right? And being transparent about this is the governance structure.
Well, and the trick was people at least knew why the decisions were made.
Exactly.
Whether they agreed with them or not, in some cases, they at least understood, and it was done on a level that wasn't emotional. For the most part, there were still some emotions involved, but it was a lot more fact-based than it had been in the past. So.
Yeah, this is a really good point. Transparency is not about everybody knowing everything. It's really about understanding more the process and who's responsible for making what decisions. That's more important than just having data vomited on the floor. That's not all that helpful, right? Passing it to Mike.
I concur. I think that you can talk about transparency in the sense of Nike to continue on that theme, and that they just everything they're doing, the bad and the good is all out there in the open for everybody to see. WikiLeaks and what's going on, and with WikiLeaks is an example of what you think that with transparency. And I completely agree. Is that it's going to get out there anyway. And if you're doing something that you're not very proud of, you need to ask yourself why you're doing that. And you need to think about every time, as a senior executive, I think you need to, every time you make a major decision, I think you need to think about if you would make that decision and what would you say to the judge. Yeah, and if you can go home every night and that's your process, you're not ashamed or embarrassed by anything. These are our values. This is how we made the decision. Then I think that's what transparency is all about. That's what consumers want. That's what we all want from our leaders.
It's okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Quick question for Dr. Griffy-Brown. Given your experience in Asia, see with the Japanese economy, they have high rate of savings.
Yes.
In the U.S.,
yes,
die by its cliff, for its exorbitant spending.
Correct.
Now the American savings rate's gone up, our spending's gone down. We're going into that same model. In your opinion, given your experience in Japan, is there something that the economy / government can do besides, spending money we don't have?
Yeah. I have a grandmother who always says, back in my day, we didn't have any money, we just stopped buying things. That was kind of her assessment of the economy, and there's a lot to be said for that, right? Yeah. A lot to be said for that. Yeah. And I would say that it's unclear if there are a lot of regulatory or policy lessons from Japan that apply, because quite frankly, they've tried everything. For the last, in terms of government intervention, a lot of the things that we're tried that, check. It's just a monolithic problem that is very complex. And so I don't know, even if we could pull on all the levers, what the result would be. But ultimately, I think Linnea had a lot to say that was extremely important in this regard, and that is the ability to be self-organized and to create trust through self-organization is going to be extremely important. The savings is very different, but what's very interesting is prior to their economic they also were developing the younger people are using credit at extraordinary rates. And in fact, the mobile phone platform that was originally developed there, iMode, that is now everywhere. We all have our mobile phones that are internet ready. One of the pieces that was built out from that was an electronic wallet. So your phone was your wallet, was your credit card, and that company became a credit card company, basically, in addition to a phone service company. So they have, particularly the younger generation, has a different view of credit than the older does. So I'm not sure that that government intervention would help, but certainly having the savings that was in place, and particularly where the savings is in place in Japan, because most people not only save in a bank, they save at this is a post-war legacy. They put their savings in a postal savings account, which is basically goes back into the government. And so, and it's really, really low, always has been low interest rate, but it's extremely safe because it's basically a government-insured savings account. So there was a lot more liquidity in their range of political maneuvers than we have, because we have such an extraordinary level of debt, and this is where the math is really frightening. And quite frankly, I don't know how they would have coped as well as they had if they didn't have that. So we're in for some interesting times, that's for sure. Whether policy can assist us in any way, I don't know. I absolutely don't know. That's a great question. I don't know.
Mark, can I put you on the spot for a bit? We just got back from Japan and we had that same discussion, and we learned about how the Japanese would rather invest in a 1%
right.
Investment at home versus a 2-3% abroad. And could you give us an insight about that investment, about nationalism, and how that's affecting them compared to how they're invested here in the United States?
Yeah, I mean, that sort of home bias is actually true throughout the world. It's just that the Japanese have a lot more savings. And the government's benefited from it in the sense that they have a huge debt to GDP ratio, but nobody's panicking. I mean, it was much higher than Greece. So I think that's in that sense helped them. But it's hurt consumers. So, but that's an exchange that Japanese people seem to be willing to make. But even in the U.S., I mean, we tend to invest in U.S. stocks and put our money in U.S. securities. So I think that's a general phenomenon. It's just bigger in Japan.
Is there any other additional questions? We've got a couple minutes left. Thank you.
So for Professor Crooke, about looking at corporate and social responsibility through a SEER lens, is there an economic analysis perspective that you apply? And I guess I think of two obvious examples. One would be a company that generates windfall profits and then has a standalone foundation that maybe gives things in a philanthropic manner, but they still have their operations ongoing that maximize the profit. Or things, I guess I'll use a Nike example, where they've been able to integrate some of those profits to kind of keep more dollars in the economy that are generating growth in that sense. Do you evaluate it or break it down into those two camps, or is it more complex than that?
I think that's a good framework. Google might be a good example of the Google.org, and their philanthropic arm, different from the for-profit arm. Nike and the model that I'm proposing, some of those other companies that I highlighted up there, it's more one of the more the Peter Drucker approach, if you will, where it's integrated into all aspects of your business. And given the change of resources in our economy and what's going on today, I would argue that it has to be integrated, because you have to be looking at the environment and whatever your product is, and you have to be looking at stakeholders, all aspects of your stakeholders from one side to the other at the same time. And of course, you have to have a great product or service, and that means you have to have innovation, and you have to have great people. It has to be a place that people want to work and want to come to, and you have to have a choice of the best workers, because they have a choice to go wherever they want to go. So I would subscribe to the latter, but it is being done successfully in places like Google very well. So.
Excellent. Will you please join me in thank you, our